Frank Sinatra stopped the most glamorous show on earth and plunged the Copacabana into silence when Marilyn Monroe walked in, fragile and weeping. The king of cool saw the heartbreaking truth, a secret act of kindness the world had missed, and he was about to expose the cruelest lie ever told about her. The year was 1961. This wasn't just any show, it was Sinatra at the Copa. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with Hollywood royalty, New York society, and men who ran the city from smoke-filled back rooms. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the blue-gray haze of 1,000 cigarettes. Diamonds glittered on wrists and throats, catching the low stage lights. The clinking of ice and highball glasses was the room's heartbeat, and Frank was its soul. He was on fire, owning that stage, a glass of amber liquid sitting on the piano. He was the king, and this was his court. He was untouchable, in complete control. And then, silence. Nelson Riddle's orchestra just vanished. The violinists froze, their bows hanging in the air. The crowd didn't know what to do. They looked at each other, confused. Did the microphone break? Did Frank forget the words? Never. Frank never stopped, but he wasn't looking at them. He wasn't looking at his band. He was staring, frozen, at that polished wooden doorway, and that's when they saw her. She hadn't walked to her table. She hadn't made an entrance. She just appeared, stumbled in from the lobby, alone. It was Marilyn Monroe. But this wasn't the Marilyn of the magazines. This wasn't the sparkling goddess of Some Like It Hot. This was a woman who looked utterly, completely fragile. Her hair, that famous platinum blonde, was disheveled. Her makeup was smudged, not in a glamorous way, but in a way that spoke of tears. Deep, painful tears. She clutched a small, beaded purse to her chest with both hands as if it were a life raft in a storm. A ripple went through the room. It started as a whisper. Then it became a low, ugly murmur. You could hear the sound of the gossip. Is she drunk again? What a mess. Look at the state of her. The flashbulbs started popping, one after another, like small, cruel explosions, bathing her in a light she clearly didn't want. The gossip columnists, the jackals who made their living tearing her apart, were leaning in, their faces alive with the scent of a story. They were vultures, and she was their next meal. But Frank didn't see a mess. He didn't see a scandal. He saw her. He saw the panic in her eyes, the desperate search for one friendly face in a sea of sharks. He saw the tremble in her lip, and something inside that tough, swaggering exterior just cracked. That famous Carson cool, the blue-eyed confidence, was gone. In its place was a quiet, protective fury. Frank saw the pain, and he knew the cruel, ugly lie the entire audience was believing. He watched her for 1 second more as she stood there, paralyzed by the lights and the whispers, a lamb surrounded by wolves. Frank lowered his hand. He stepped away from the microphone, his eyes never leaving her face. The audience held its breath, waiting to see what the king would do next. To understand that woman in the doorway, you have to forget the photographs. Frank Sinatra didn't just see a mess in that doorway. He saw the ashes of 1961. He saw the woman who had just walked out of the desert hell of the Nevada set of The Misfits. It was a picture that was supposed to be a triumph. It was written for her by her husband, the great playwright Arthur Miller. It was her chance to finally prove to the world that she was a real actress, not just a fantasy. Instead, it was a nightmare. The heat was unbearable, regularly climbing over 100 degrees. The emotional toll was far worse. By the time the film was finished, so was her marriage. The divorce was public, brutal, and humiliating. The man she had looked to as her intellectual anchor, her safe harbor, was gone. And the press, the gossip columnists, were relentless. They smelled weakness. They painted her as difficult, unreliable, a mess. They never wrote about the crippling stage fright she fought every single day. They never wrote about the insomnia that plagued her, the nights she spent staring at the ceiling, terrified of letting everyone down. She was running on empty, with no safe place to just be. And that exhausted, terrified woman was the one Frank saw stumble into the Copacabana. She was the most famous woman on the planet, and she was desperately lonely. Think about that. To be in a room with 100 people, all of them looking at you, and to feel completely invisible. That was her life. She would go to these glittering premieres and smile until her face ached. Then she would go home to an empty apartment, just her and her doubts. People didn't see her. They saw a bombshell. They saw a fantasy. They saw a product. They all wanted something from her. Her name, her light, her magic, but they didn't want her pain. She was running on empty, with no one to turn to, no safe place to just be Norma Jean. She was drowning in the spotlight, and almost everyone was happy to watch, but not everyone. One man saw past the smoke and mirrors. One man saw the woman behind the legend. Frank Sinatra saw it all. He saw the whispers, he saw the flashbulbs, and he saw the woman behind the mess. Because he wasn't just Marilyn's friend, he was her protector. And he saw something in her that the flashbulbs and the rest of the world always missed. People always assumed, they always whispered. Were they lovers? It was so much deeper than that, so much more complicated. To Frank, Marilyn wasn't a bombshell and she wasn't a fling. She was, in a strange way, family. He understood her because, in a way, they were the same. He was the skinny kid from Hoboken who'd had to fight for every scrap of respect. She was the orphan girl from nowhere who had been told her whole life she was nothing. They were both survivors, creations. He knew Marilyn Monroe was a beautiful suit of armor, and he knew the hidden, compassionate truth of the heart beating fiercely beneath it. He had a private name for her. He called her Poet, not Blondie, not Sugar, Poet. He'd seen the stacks of books by her bed, poetry by Rilke, novels by Dostoevsky. He knew she was brilliant, intuitive, and as fragile as spun glass. He once told his piano player, "They all want a cartoon, but they got a poet, and this town doesn't know what to do with a poet, especially one who looks like that." And it was that poet he saw standing in the doorway about to shatter. It made his blood boil. He despised the jackals, as he called them, the gossip columnists, the photographers. He hated how they circled her, how they nipped at her heels just waiting for her to stumble so they could rip her to shreds. To him, they weren't just taking pictures, they were throwing stones. He had made her a promise. It was just a few months earlier, late one night at his home in Palm Springs. She had been inconsolable, terrified of the whispers, of the studios, of the crushing loneliness. She'd called him, sobbing after a photographer had intentionally pushed her to the ground. He'd poured her a glass of water, looked her straight in the eye, and made a solemn vow. "Not on my watch, poet. You're not going to fall. I swear I will never let them push you again." Now, standing in the doorway of the Copa, she was falling. The jackals were circling, and Frank Sinatra was a man who kept his promises. But that look on her face, it wasn't just fear. It was grief. He knew she hadn't come to the Copa just because she was lost. She was running from somewhere. That night, Marilyn was late to Frank's show for a reason, but it wasn't a party and it wasn't another man. It was a promise she had made to a ghost. Her name was Eleanor Vance, and she was 74 years old. She was spending her final days in a small, clean room at the New York Charity Hospital 4th floor overlooking a brick wall. The name doesn't mean much to us now, but in 1923, Eleanor Vance was the girl with the violets, the biggest star in silent film. Her face sold tickets from Paris to Peking. She was the definition of glamour, the toast of a town that worshipped her. And then, almost overnight, the talkies came in. Her voice didn't match her face, the studio said. By 1932, she was finished, forgotten, thrown away and replaced like so much of old Hollywood. Marilyn knew who she was. Marilyn, the secret poet, the student of film, had seen her old movies. A few months earlier, she'd read a tiny 4-line article in the back of a paper mentioning Eleanor was in hospital, alone and with no money. It struck a chord so deep in Marilyn, it terrified her. She saw herself. She saw the future that Hollywood kept for its brightest stars once their light started to dim. So, she did something no one knew about. Not her agent, not her driver, not the studios. For the past 2 months, Marilyn Monroe had been secretly visiting Eleanor Vance. She'd slip in through a side entrance wearing a scarf and sunglasses, no makeup, just Norma Jean. She would sit by that hospital bed for hours. She'd bring flowers, violets, which made Eleanor weep. And mostly, she would just listen. She'd listen to stories of a Hollywood that was gone, of the parties, the triumphs, and the crushing, terrible loneliness of being invisible. In that little room, they weren't the bombshell and the has-been. They were just 2 women who understood. That very night, Marilyn was supposed to be at the Copa at 9, but at 7:30, she got a call from a nurse. "Miss Monroe," the nurse whispered, "it's Mrs. Vance, the doctor. He says it's time. She's asking for you." Marilyn didn't even hang up the phone. She just dropped it. She grabbed her coat and ran. When she got to the hospital, Eleanor was barely holding on. Marilyn sat on the edge of that stiff bed and took Eleanor's cold, paper-thin hand in hers. For 2 hours, she sat there as the older woman faded. She whispered to her, telling her how brilliant she was, how much she mattered, how she'd never be forgotten. Just before 10 p.m., Eleanor was at rest. Marilyn sat there, still holding her hand, sobbing in the sterile quiet. She wasn't a movie star. She was just a woman grieving for her friend. That was the state she was in. Her mascara wasn't smudged from partying. It was washed away by real painful tears. She finally stumbled out of the hospital, emotionally shattered, blinded by her grief. She didn't know where to go. She just wanted to see one friendly face. She told the driver, the Copa. She wasn't looking for an audience. She was looking for a lifeline. When Marilyn finally left the sterile, heavy silence of that hospital and pushed through the polished brass doors of the Copacabana, the sound hit her like a physical blow. The sudden blast of laughter, of clinking glasses, of a full brass orchestra was deafening. After 2 hours of sitting in a quiet room, holding a hand as it grew cold, this world, this glittering, noisy, careless world, felt obscene. It felt wrong. She wasn't drunk. She was in shock. She was grieving. The air, thick with smoke and perfume, felt hard to breathe. The low, golden lights of the club, meant to be intimate and glamorous, felt harsh and interrogating. She hadn't even realized the music had stopped. All she knew was that she was in the wrong place. She'd made a mistake. She just wanted to turn and run, go back to her apartment and be alone. But she was frozen in the doorway, her feet like lead. And then she heard it. The sound that had haunted her entire adult life. The whispers. It started from the tables near the door. A woman in pearls leaned over to her husband. My God, look at the state of her. A man holding a cigar chuckled. She's smashed. Couldn't even make it on time. The whispers grew, spreading from table to table like a fire. What a mess. It's a shame, really. She's finished. Every whisper was a small, sharp stone thrown directly at her. They weren't just judging her. They were delighted to judge her. They were seeing exactly what they had come to see, a beautiful train wreck. She clutched her purse tighter. They didn't know. They couldn't possibly know. She wanted to scream at them. I was holding, but the words wouldn't come. The flashbulbs started popping again, those awful, blinding white lights. She flinched, turning her head away, which only made her look more guilty, more unstable. She was surrounded by hundreds of people, and she had never, ever felt so completely alone. Her eyes darted around the room, desperate, scanning the faces. She wasn't looking for a table. She was looking for an anchor. Then she saw him. He wasn't singing. He was standing on the stage, absolutely still, his hands at his sides. The music was gone. The entire loud, boisterous club was silent. He was just staring at her. She locked eyes with Frank across that room, and in that one shattering moment, she didn't see Frank Sinatra, the king of the Copa. She saw her friend. She saw her protector, and the dam just broke. The iron-clad mask of Marilyn Monroe that she tried to hold together just disintegrated. Her lip trembled. She didn't want him to just save her from the crowd. Her eyes were a silent, tearful plea. Frank, tell them the truth. Tell them what happened. All the pain, all the grief for Eleanor, all the loneliness of the past year rose to the surface. She was just a girl in a room full of strangers begging for help with just one look. Frank saw her face. He saw her silent plea. He saw the jackals at the front tables, pens scribbling, cameras flashing, and that protective vow he'd made, that quiet promise in Palm Springs, kicked in like a physical force. In that instant, he wasn't Frank Sinatra, the entertainer, anymore. He was just a man defending his friend. The orchestra was already silent, frozen in time. Nelson Riddle stood with his conductor's baton raised, his face a mask of confusion. The violinist's bows were still hanging in the air, a chord unfinished. The only sound in the entire Copacabana, a room built on noise and laughter, was the ugly, metallic click, 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 click of the cameras. The photographers were having a field day. They were scrambling, pushing, getting closer to the doorway, capturing every tear, every tremble. To Frank, that sound, the click, 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 was the sound of wolves tearing at his friend. His face hardened. This wasn't embarrassing. This was rage, a cold, controlled, Hoboken Alley kind of rage. He wasn't ashamed of her. He was furious for her. He stepped away from the polished silver microphone, a move that stunned the audience. The microphone was his home, his weapon, his shield. By stepping away, he was breaking the fourth wall. He was no longer the performer. He walked slowly, deliberately, to the very edge of the stage. The low lights caught his face. His famous blue eyes weren't sparkling. They were blue steel. As one writer later put it, they were hard, cold, and scanning. He wasn't looking at Marilyn. He'd seen all he needed to see from her. He was looking at the audience. His gaze swept across the front tables one by one. He saw them. He saw the gossip columnist from the Mirror, her pen scribbling furiously in her notepad. He saw the photographer from Confidential, a smirk on his face as he reloaded his flash. He saw the producers, the agents, the hangers-on, all of them whispering, judging, enjoying the spectacle. He was taking a role. He was identifying every single person who was throwing a stone. The silence in the room became unbearable. It was heavy, terrifying. You could have heard a match drop. The audience was frozen. This wasn't part of the show. This was something real, something raw, something dangerous. Frank Sinatra, the king, was angry, and no one knew what he was about to do. He let that silence stretch on. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. He let them feel the weight of their own judgment. He had seen enough. He had seen the jury, and he was ready to be the judge. He turned, his face set like stone. He walked back to the microphone, not as a singer, but as a man about to pass a sentence. Frank gripped the microphone, his knuckles white. He leaned in, not as a singer, but as a brawler. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room with a cold, clear fury. "You all think you know this woman," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know anything at all." He let the words hang in the air. The silence was absolute. "You saw what you wanted to see, didn't you?" He continued, his eyes scanning the front tables, landing on the gossip columnist from the Mirror. "You saw a mess. You saw a headline for tomorrow. You saw a girl who was late and drunk." He shook his head, a look of profound disgust on his face. "You sit there, you and you." He pointed first at the columnist, then at the photographer. "With your pads and your flashbulbs just waiting for her to go on a trip, waiting for her to fall apart so you can feel good about yourselves tomorrow." He turned his attention back to the whole room. "You want to know where she was? You want to know why she's late? Why is her makeup not perfect?" The room held its breath. Marilyn was still standing in the doorway, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She was watching him defend her. "She wasn't at a party," Frank said, his voice growing thick with emotion. "She wasn't at 21 with some millionaire. She was on the 4th floor of the charity hospital holding the hand of a woman this town threw away 30 years ago. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. "Her name was Eleanor Vance," Frank went on. "Meant nothing to you, right? But she used to be a star, a bigger star than anyone in this room. And this town? You people, you forgot her. You let her fade away in a room with a brick wall, but she didn't." He pointed, not at Marilyn, but at the doorway where she stood, as if protecting her. "Norma Jean, she remembered. While you were ordering your second steak, she was sitting by that bed. While you were worried about your reservations, she was listening to a lonely woman's final stories. She's late tonight because she stayed until the very end. She held that woman's hand as she was at rest. Her mascara isn't smudged from a party. It's smudged because she was grieving for a stranger." He leaned in one last time. "You want to see a star? You're all looking in the wrong direction. A star isn't someone who shows up for the cameras. Any bum can do that. A star, a real star, is someone who shows up when there are no cameras, when there's no glory, when it's just a dark room and a forgotten woman and a hand to hold." He looked back at the audience, his eyes still hard. This is not a mess. This is not a headline. This is the bravest, most loyal, most tender heart in this entire goddamn town. And that's the truth. The room was silent. The gossip columnist had put her pen down, her face pale. The photographers were just holding their cameras. Frank had done more than stop the show. He had held up a mirror, and the entire room was ashamed of what they saw. For a full 30 seconds, nobody in the Copacabana moved. The columnists stared at their blank notebooks, their faces ashen. The audience was frozen, not in confusion anymore, but in a deep, profound shame. Then Frank did something else. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't acknowledge the stunned silence. He simply turned his back to the humbled crowd and faced his orchestra. He looked at his pianist, Bill Miller, and gave a single, slow nod. He turned back, but he didn't look at the audience. He looked straight across the room to the doorway where Marilyn was still standing, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. A few sparse, lonely notes from the piano began to play. Frank began to sing. But this wasn't the brash, swaggering Frank. His voice was soft, raw, and full of a melancholy he rarely showed in public. He sang "One for my baby and one more for the road." And he sang the entire song, every single word, directly to her. It was a private message, delivered on a public stage. He was telling her, "I see you. I know. You're safe." The room was dead silent. The only sound was that lonely piano and Frank's voice cracking with an emotion he rarely showed. He was telling her story, when he sang the final line, and one more for the road. He almost whispered it. A benediction. The last piano note faded into the thick, smoky air. Frank took the microphone from its stand. He didn't put it back. He just let it drop to his side, and he stepped off the stage. He started walking right through the middle of the room. He walked past the columnists who wouldn't meet his eyes. He walked past the producers who just stared, speechless. He walked a direct path straight to the doorway. He stopped 1 foot in front of Marilyn. He just offered his arm. A simple, old-world gesture. An invitation. A shield. Marilyn looked at his arm, then at his face. She took a shaky breath and slowly placed her hand in the crook of his elbow. And that's when it happened. Slowly, then in a wave, the entire room stood up. They weren't applauding Frank. They were giving Marilyn Monroe a standing ovation. Not the polite kind for a star. This was a real one. An apology. A recognition. The only people left sitting were the press. They just sat there, their notebooks closed, defeated. Frank held her arm tightly. He gave the stunned, applauding audience a single, curt nod. Then he turned, shielding her with his body, and walked her out of the club, away from the applause, and into the night. The story, for the public, was over. The next morning, the New York gossip columns were quiet. For the first time in memory, the jackals had no appetite. Frank's words at the Copa had been too public, the truth too raw to twist into a simple, ugly headline. The story, for the public, was over. But the real postscript to that night, the one that truly mattered, arrived a week later. It arrived at Frank's office, not his home, in a simple white envelope with the New York Charity Hospital's return address. Inside was a letter, not typed, but written in the careful, looping cursive of an older woman. It was from the head nurse on the 4th floor, the one who had called Marilyn that night. She wrote that just a few days after the incident at the club, Eleanor Vance had found her peace. She had slipped away quietly in her sleep, the nurse wrote. The room was calm. The nurse continued, Mr. Sinatra, I'm writing to you, sir, because I don't know how to reach Miss Monroe. And, well, the entire staff heard what you said at the club. We heard how you stood up for her. We see so much sadness in this place, and what you did, it gave us all such a heart. But I had to write to you, sir, because you only told them half the story. Frank leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the page. What did she mean? Half? You were right, the letter went on. Miss Monroe was the only visitor Miss Vance had, but she did more than visit. 2 months ago, an anonymous donation was made to the hospital, a very large one. It was enough to move Miss Vance out of the general ward. Frank's eyes widened. And into our best private room. A bright room, Mr. Sinatra, with a window that overlooks the park, not that awful brick wall. The donation paid for everything. Private nurses, round the clock, the best specialists, meals she actually enjoyed. We all just thought it was some old Hollywood foundation trying to clear its conscience. The nurse's handwriting started to get a little shaky, but when Miss Vance was at rest, the hospital administrator had to arrange the final details, and he found that the same anonymous donor had already paid for everything. A beautiful funeral service, a fine casket, and a specific instruction that there were to be violets, hundreds of them, everywhere. Mr. Sinatra, the only person who knew Miss Vance loved violets, was Miss Monroe. Frank read the last paragraph 3 times. Our administrator, he's a tough man, but he just stood there looking at the file, and he said to me, it was her. It was that girl all along, and she never said a single word. She wasn't just giving an old star her time, Mr. Sinatra. She was giving her back her dignity. Frank slowly, carefully folded the letter. His poet, the woman they hounded, the woman they called a mess, had quietly, secretly given a forgotten woman a graceful, dignified farewell. He opened the bottom drawer of his heavy mahogany desk. He placed the letter inside, next to a few other things that mattered. He closed the drawer, bearing the secret. The world could have its photographs of Marilyn. He had the truth. We love to look at the pictures of Marilyn, the white dress, the red lipstick, the perfect smile. We look, but we don't see. We see the icon, the legend, the tragedy. We see the fantasy that Hollywood built. We see the woman in the headlines, the mess the columnists wanted us to see. We have looked at those pictures for more than 60 years, but we never really saw the woman. We see the bombshell. We don't see the poet, the girl reading Rilke by her bedside. We see scandals. We don't see the woman who, remembering what it was like to be forgotten, secretly visited a fallen star from a forgotten era. We see the unreliable actress. We don't see the friend who sat for 2 hours holding a dying woman's hand just so she wouldn't be alone when she was at rest. We've been looking at the wrong picture. That night at the Copacabana, the audience was just like us. They came to be entertained. They came to see Frank Sinatra and Marilyn Monroe. They came expecting a show and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of drama. They were ready to look at a train wreck. But Frank, in that one powerful, furious moment, did something profound. He stopped the show. He refused to let them just look. He forced them to see. He held up a mirror, not to her, but to them. He forced them to see the heart behind the image. He forced them to see the grief behind the stumble, the profound compassion that the headlines would never, ever print. He forced them to see a woman who, in her own moment of profound loss, was being torn apart by their judgment. And at that moment, he changed the room. He didn't just defend his friend. He reminded every single person in that club what it means to be human. He reminded them that kindness is more powerful than glamour. That loyalty is more important than fame. This story, tonight, it's a fantasy perhaps, but it's a fantasy that asks a very real question. How do we look at the people in our own lives? The people we think we know. The neighbor who seems difficult, the family member who seems distant, the person who just seems like a mess. Do we just look? Do we see the surface? Do we believe the whispers, the gossip, the easy headline? Do we wait for them to stumble? Or do we try to see? Do we look for the battle they might be fighting? Do we wonder about the invisible, heavy thing they're carrying? Do we look for Eleanor Vance in their story? Do we see the private pain they're carrying, the secret kindness they're showing when no one is watching? We all have that power. We can all be the person who sees the poet when the world is screaming mess. We can all choose to be the one who offers an arm instead of throwing a stone. Frank Sinatra had a world of fame, power, and influence, but his greatest moment might not have been a song he sang. It might have been the one he stopped. He saw his friend drowning in a sea of judgment, and he didn't just throw her a lifeline. He had the courage to stand up, silence the storm, and calm the entire ocean. We look, but we often forget to see the real person behind the legend. If Frank's stand for his friend reminded you of the profound power of loyalty and kindness, please give this video a like. And for more stories about the hidden human moments that truly define Hollywood's biggest stars, make sure you subscribe to the channel.